Welcome to the Story Atelier, a place where meaningful, touching, and inspiring stories are brought to life through captivating storytelling. Join us as we listen, feel, and uncover profound lessons from everyday moments that carry extraordinary significance. Today, we bring you a story that's truly special. Imagine stopping at a small roadside diner, just to grab a cup of coffee and continue your journey. But then, a small detail catches your eye. And in that moment, you realize something isn't right, and that realization ends up changing a child's life forever. This story is about courage, perception, and the importance of stepping up when someone needs help. It's the story of Black Girl at Rest Stop with White Dad. Marine notices SOS gesture and springs into action. Let's dive into the details of this emotional tale and explore the power of empathy and kindness. Under the fading light of a dusky sky, the Ridgewood Diner sat quietly along a stretch of desolate highway. It was the kind of place frequented by truckers, late-night travelers, and locals looking for a moment of respite from their journeys. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an inviting glow over the otherwise lonely road. Inside, the air was filled with the hum of an old jukebox and the faint clinking of dishes. It was just another evening, or so it seemed. Elliot Carter, a retired Army sergeant, entered the diner with the intention of grabbing a coffee before continuing his drive back to Virginia. Years of military service had instilled in him an instinct for reading people and situations. Tonight, as he stepped into the modest diner, that instinct would be tested in ways he never anticipated. The moment Elliot walked in, his eyes scanned the room, an old habit that never left him. The diner was sparsely populated. A couple sat at the counter chatting with the waitress. A trucker was engrossed in his plate of meatloaf. And near the corner window, a young girl sat in stiff silence. Her wide, frightened eyes and uneasy demeanor immediately caught his attention. She couldn't have been older than 9, with cocoa-colored skin and a mop of curls framing her face. Across from her sat a man in his late 40s, wearing a formal black suit that seemed out of place in the casual setting. Elliot found his gaze lingering on the duo. Something about the way the man glanced over his newspaper at the girl seemed wrong. His gaze wasn't that of a protective guardian, it was cold, calculated, and unnerving. The girl, seated on the edge of her chair, fiddled nervously with a napkin, her shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink away. Elliot felt a twinge of unease. Years of experience in high-stakes situations had taught him to trust his gut. And tonight, it was screaming that something was off. He walked casually to the counter, ordered his coffee, and positioned himself at a booth that gave him a clear view of the corner table without drawing too much attention. The girl's eyes darted around the room but returned to the window often, as though looking for an escape. When she glanced at Elliot, there was a fleeting moment of connection, a silent plea in her gaze. Then, she did something subtle but unmistakable. She raised her hand, palm outward, fingers slightly curled, a gesture Elliot immediately recognized. It was the universal hand signal for help, often taught to children in distress. The sight made his stomach knot. Elliot took a deep breath and considered his options. He couldn't act rashly. He needed to confirm the situation first. Without raising suspicion, he pulled out his phone and discreetly texted 911, describing the location, the man, and the girl. His message was brief but detailed enough to ensure law enforcement would understand the urgency. Elliot glanced back at the corner table. The man was speaking to the girl now, his voice low but sharp, his expression hardening. The girl flinched, her hands trembling as she clutched her napkin. Elliot's resolve hardened. He couldn't just sit by and wait for the police. He stood, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the vending machine near the table. As he fiddled with the machine, he angled himself to listen in on the conversation. The man was pressing the girl for answers, though his words were vague. You're going to behave, right? He muttered. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. The girl's response was a small, terrified nod. Elliot's military instincts kicked into overdrive. He couldn't let this continue. He approached their table, his expression calm but his posture firm. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the man. "Is everything all right here?" The man looked up, startled, his forced smile not reaching his eyes. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied curtly. "Just having a meal with my niece." Elliot shifted his gaze to the girl. "Is that true?" he asked gently, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. The girl didn't respond, but her hands clenched tightly, her eyes welling with tears. That silence spoke volumes. Before the situation could escalate further, the faint sound of sirens cut through the air. Relief washed over Elliot as the police cruiser pulled up outside the diner. 2 officers entered, their expressions serious as they scanned the room. Elliot stood back, gesturing subtly toward the man and the girl. One officer approached the table, addressing the man with a firm tone. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions." The man's demeanor shifted instantly. "What's this about?" he demanded, his voice rising. "She's my niece. We're just having dinner." The officer's steady gaze didn't waver. "We've received a report. Please cooperate." The man stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed, but his tone betrayed his nerves. The officers flanked him, one placing a firm hand on his shoulder while the other knelt beside the girl, speaking softly to her. Elliot stayed back, watching the scene unfold. The girl's tearful nod and quiet words to the officer confirmed his suspicions. As the man was led out in handcuffs, Elliot felt a wave of relief. The girl was safe, for now. The officer who had spoken to the girl turned to Elliot. "Thanks for the tip," he said. "This could have ended much worse if you hadn't stepped in." Elliot nodded, his gaze lingering on the girl as she was gently guided outside. For the first time that evening, she looked at him with something resembling hope. As the diner returned to its quiet state, Elliot sat back down, his coffee untouched. He stared out the window at the flashing police lights, his mind replaying the events of the night. He had no idea what would come next, but he was certain of one thing: he had made the right choice. The Ridgewood police station was bustling when Elliot Carter arrived later that evening. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as officers moved back and forth with an air of efficiency. Elliot was directed to a small waiting area, his mind racing as he pieced together the events from the diner. Though he had intervened, the details of what had led to that terrifying scene remained a mystery. The girl, still nameless to him, had been taken to a separate room for questioning. Elliot sat quietly, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. Across the room, the man who had claimed to be the girl's uncle sat in a holding cell, his previously confident demeanor now replaced by visible agitation. He fidgeted, muttering under his breath, casting occasional glances toward the officers who passed by. The sight only fueled Elliot's suspicions. Minutes felt like hours before a young officer approached him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone professional but kind. "Thank you for coming down to the station. We just need a quick statement from you about what happened tonight." Elliot nodded and followed her into a small interrogation room. He recounted everything: the man's unsettling behavior, the girl's nervous gestures, and most importantly, the distress signal she had subtly given. The officer jotted down notes, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "Do you know who she is?" Elliot asked as he finished. "The girl. I mean, did you figure out what's going on?" The officer hesitated before responding. "We're still piecing everything together," she said carefully. "The girl's name is Chloe Daniels. She's 9 years old and was reported missing 3 days ago. Her parents have been frantic trying to find her." Elliot's heart sank. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed hit him like a blow. And the man? He asked. Who is he? The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He's not her uncle, she said firmly. His name is Gerald Whittaker. He has a history of criminal behavior. Though nothing as serious as this, until now. We're still questioning him, but he's been uncooperative. Elliot's jaw tightened. The image of Chloe's frightened eyes flashed through his mind. Is she all right? He asked quietly. She's shaken but physically unharmed. The officer assured him. She's with a social worker right now, and her parents are on their way to pick her up. Relief washed over Elliot, but it was tempered by a lingering anger. How could someone do something so vile? And how had Chloe ended up in Gerald's clutches to begin with? He voiced the latter question, and the officer sighed. According to Chloe, Gerald approached her at a park near her home. The officer explained. He tricked her into believing he was a family friend sent to pick her up. Once she realized something was wrong, it was too late. He'd already taken her to another state. Elliot shook his head, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. What happens now? He asked. Well, Gerald will face charges, and Chloe's family will work to rebuild their lives. The officer replied. As for you, Mr. Carter, you did something extraordinary tonight. If you hadn't acted, who knows how much longer this would have gone on. Elliot shrugged, brushing off the praise. Anyone would have done the same. The officer smiled faintly. Not everyone does. Most people don't notice the signs, or they're too afraid to get involved. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Moments later, a man and a woman burst into view, their faces etched with a mix of desperation and hope. They were directed to a room down the hall, where Elliot assumed Chloe was waiting. He watched them go, his chest tightening at the thought of the reunion that was about to take place. A few minutes later, the officer returned, her expression softer now. Chloe's parents would like to meet you. If you're willing, she said. Elliot hesitated. He wasn't sure what to say to them. What could he say? But he nodded and followed the officer down the hallway. When they entered the room, the sight before him was heartwarming. Chloe was wrapped in her mother's arms, her father kneeling beside them, tears streaming down his face. They looked up as Elliot entered, the gratitude evident in their eyes. Mr. Carter, the father said, standing and extending a hand. I'm Nathan Daniels. This is my wife, Rachel. I don't even know where to begin to thank you. Elliot shook Nathan's hand, his grip firm but gentle. I'm just glad Chloe's safe, he said simply. Rachel approached, her voice trembling with emotion. We thought we'd lost her, she said, but because of you, she's back with us. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. Chloe looked up at Elliot then, her wide eyes no longer filled with fear but with something else, admiration. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot crouched to her level, his tone gentle. You're very brave, Chloe, he said. What you did tonight, that signal, it saved you. You should be proud of yourself. She managed a small smile. And in that moment, Elliot felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever challenges had brought him to this point in life, they had all led to this moment. And for that, he was grateful. As the Daniels family prepared to leave, Nathan turned to Elliot once more. If you're ever in town, please let us know, he said earnestly. We'd love to have you over. You're part of our family now. Elliot nodded, though he wasn't sure if he'd take him up on the offer. For now, it was enough to know that Chloe was safe and her family was whole again. Later that night, as Elliot drove back toward Virginia, the events replayed in his mind. He had stepped into that diner expecting nothing more than a cup of coffee. But he had left having made a profound difference in the lives of people he'd never met before. It was a humbling thought, one that stayed with him as the miles stretched on. A week had passed since the events at Richwood Diner. But for Elliot Carter, the memory remained vivid. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see Chloe's wide, frightened eyes and feel the intensity of that night. He had spent years in the army, faced life or death situations. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield, it was everyday life. And the stakes had felt just as high. Elliot hadn't planned on staying in touch with Chloe's family. He figured his part in their story was over. But when an envelope arrived at his small townhouse, he couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting on the front was neat and deliberate. Inside was a handwritten letter. Dear Mr. Carter, I don't know how to put into words what you've done for us. You didn't just save Chloe's life, you saved our family. For days, we lived in fear, not knowing if we'd ever see her again. Because of you, we have her back. Chloe talks about you constantly. She says you're her hero. And I can't disagree. You didn't just notice her distress, you acted when most people might have looked the other way. That takes courage, kindness, and a heart bigger than words can describe. We'd love for you to visit us this weekend. Chloe has something she wants to give you, and we'd like the chance to thank you properly. Please consider this our way of showing how much you mean to us. With endless gratitude, Nathan, Rachel, and Chloe Daniels. Elliot set the letter down and leaned back in his chair. He hadn't been expecting anything like this, and part of him wanted to decline. He wasn't one for accolades or special attention. But another part of him, the part that had seen Chloe's brave face in the diner, felt compelled to go. Perhaps it was time to let the story come full circle. That Saturday, Elliot found himself driving down a quiet suburban street lined with tidy lawns and modest homes. When he reached the Daniels address, a small but welcoming house with a white picket fence, he parked and took a deep breath before heading to the door. Nathan greeted him with a warm handshake, his face lighting up at the sight of Elliot. "We're so glad you came," he said, ushering him inside. The house was cozy, filled with family photos, soft light, and the scent of something delicious wafting from the kitchen. Rachel appeared next, her smile just as genuine. She hugged Elliot briefly, thanking him once again for everything he had done. "Chloe's in the backyard," Nathan said, leading Elliot through the house. "She's been looking forward to this all week." When they stepped outside, Elliot was met with the sight of a lively family gathering. A small group of relatives and neighbors milled about, chatting and laughing as children played on the lawn. In the center of it all was Chloe, sitting at a picnic table with a small box in her lap. When she spotted Elliot, her face lit up, and she ran over to him. "Mr. Carter," she exclaimed, stopping just short of hugging him. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled shyly. "I made something for you." Elliot crouched down to her level, his curiosity piqued. "You did? What is it?" Chloe opened the box to reveal a bracelet made of colorful beads. Each bead was carefully chosen, spelling out the word, hero. She handed it to him with a sense of pride. "It's for you," she said, "because you're my hero." Elliot felt a lump form in his throat. He took the bracelet gently, slipping it onto his wrist. "Thank you, Chloe," he said, his voice softer than usual. "This means a lot to me." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of warmth and gratitude. Nathan and Rachel introduced Elliot to their friends and family, each person expressing their thanks in their own way. For Elliot, it was an unexpected but welcome reminder of the impact one act of courage could have. Later, as the sun began to set, Nathan pulled Elliot aside. They stood near the edge of the yard, the golden light casting long shadows over the grass. "I wanted to tell you something," Nathan said, his tone serious but heartfelt. "When Chloe was taken, I lost faith in a lot of things. I questioned whether there was any goodness left in the world. But then you came along. And you reminded me that there are still people who care, people willing to step up when it matters most. Elliot nodded, his gaze steady. I just did what anyone should do, he said. Nathan shook his head. That's where you're wrong. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. You didn't just save Chloe. You restored something in all of us. As the evening wound down, Chloe approached Elliot one last time. She held a small stuffed bear. Its fur worn but clean. I want you to have this, she said, holding it out to him. Elliot shook his head, smiling. I think you should keep it. Chloe. She shook her head firmly. No, I want you to have it. So you can always remember me. Touched, Elliot accepted the bear, promising to keep it safe. As he said his goodbyes and drove away, he couldn't help but glance at the stuffed bear sitting on his passenger seat. It was a simple gesture, but to him, it symbolized something far greater. That night, as Elliot returned home, he realized that his own life had changed. The courage he had shown that night at Ridgewood Diner wasn't just about protecting Chloe, it was about rediscovering the kind of person he wanted to be. In helping Chloe, he had found a renewed sense of purpose and connection. Sometimes, the smallest actions had the biggest impact. And sometimes, those actions not only saved others, they saved you too.